The Solution Zone with Christiane Brown, Thursdays at 3 p.m. Eastern Time on the Progressive Radio Network.
You want answers? You want answers.
I want the truth, the truth.
Lies, lies. They're telling me that you'll be true.
It's not even close to public service. It's public delusion.
It's always the underclass that gets hit.
It's all been about privatizing and profit.
There's no pushback from Congress.
All they're trying to do is exploit the system, hold the system hostage.
Everyone gone nuts?
Houston, we have a problem. And now, live from the Progressive Radio Network, The Solution Zone with Christiane Brown.
This is not America. It is not who we are or what we believe in.
We will continue to resist the lies, the deception, the outrages. We will insist that peace be pursued and that as a nation we help those in need. Let us join together to break the cycle of hatred, of intolerance, of violence. Let us build a better nation and a better world together.
Now, that's the kind of political candidate that we want to hear from as the 2012 elections near. Many Americans, disgusted with both the Democratic and the Republican Party's failures to solve our nation's problems, have expressed wishes for a presidential candidate who represents them and who is an alternative to our pay-to-play system, our corrupt political system. Well, that was Rocky Anderson, and today on the Solution Zone, we're bringing him to the program. Former mayor of Salt Lake City, Utah, Rocky Anderson, announced this Monday that he is going to run for the President of the United States with a new political party called the Justice Party. And Rocky, welcome to the Solution Zone. Great to have you on the program with me today.
Really great to be here with you. Thanks so much.
Let's talk about who you are. Now, I've been following you for a long time. Many people in the United States have, because in a sense, you seemed at first to be an anomaly. One of the most progressive mayors in America, the mayor of Salt Lake City, Utah, from 2000 to 2008. But you were mayor of a red state, and during that time, you were arguing against the Iraq War. You were arguing for environmental responsibility. You independently implemented the Kyoto Climate Change Protocols in Utah. You also were a vocal champion, again in that red state, for LGBT rights. You were able to do that. First of all, talk about how that happened and how you were able to do this in a state that seemed so predisposed to be against all of these things that you spoke very strongly for.
Well, one you felt was I was a fierce advocate for impeachment of President Bush. And I was able to do that because I believe strongly that leaders in whatever segment of our society, educators, religious leaders, political leaders, people in our neighborhoods and our families, every single one of us have a huge patriotic and moral responsibility to stand up and turn things around when we see them going so wrong. And although obviously in Utah I have a lot of detractors, and I certainly would never probably hold statewide office in Utah, it is a very conservative state, and in the sense that people there are tied to the status quo in so many ways. But as a practicing lawyer for 21 years, as an involved citizen in a lot of nonprofit organizations in the community, one who always tried to contribute, I really understand, I think, that we're only going to see change if we come together, if we organize, if every one of us plays an important role, and all of us have such a vital role to play. And be upstanders, don't be accommodators, don't just be bystanders when we see our country changing so much for the worse. Stand up and play an active role. And that's really what the Justice Party is based on. That's what my candidacy is based on. It's based on the belief that we, as the American people, regardless of our prior partisan affiliations, can work together and fight for our government working for us for a change rather than being so swayed day after day by the corrupting influence of money.
I want to play a clip. This is you talking about accountability, and I want to discuss it after we listen to this because I believe that you, like many people, feel like the lack of accountability has been one of the things that's led us to where we are. Here it is.
What is a democracy? What has happened to the rule of law? What has happened to our moral principles when such lawlessness and immorality can occur and continue with absolutely no accountability? Some people talk about winning or losing the so-called war on terror, as if we could ever win by creating so much hatred and bitterness throughout much of the world, by committing these atrocities and militarily occupying a country that pose no security risk to our own nation. But one thing is clear. We, as a nation, have lost so much when we have abandoned, with the complacent acceptance of so many Americans, our moral bearings as a nation. When we have transformed our system of government from a constitutional democracy to a totalitarian human rights abuser. When we have abandoned the moral high road that has been the source of admiration by so many throughout the world. When we have witnessed without any meaningful challenge the assertion of the President that he is not bound by the Constitution, treaty obligations, or laws passed by Congress. And when we have allowed the executive branch without so much as an audible whimper from a spineless Congress to engage in felonious, unconstitutional electronic surveillance of our telephone and email communication.
Now, the interesting thing about that clip, Rocky, was this was during President Bush's presidency, and you hear the crowd cheering. Many people would argue that the very reasons that you stated in that speech there was why they so hopefully elected Barack Obama to the presidency in the belief, it turns out to be falsely, that he would address some of these issues, including accountability. The first thing he did when he became president is say, let's look forward, not back. If you were to be elected president, what would you do with regard to accountability of the past administration, and how important do you believe that is?
The rule of law is at the core of our Constitution. It's at the root of who we are as a country. And as things have developed now, and I think a lot of us thought this was just an aberration under President George W. Bush, but it's been institutionalized in so many respects by President Obama and his administration. We now have a country where the rule of law has been completely ignored. Our president speaks sometimes poetically about the rule of law out of one side of his mouth, and on the other side, he's talking about indefinite detention without charges, without trial, without any due process, completely in violation of our Constitution. He adds onto his assassination list the names of U.S. citizens and has them murdered. And I use that word consciously because it is completely illegal. It's our Constitution due process clause promises that life, liberty, and property will not be taken by the government without due process of law. And now we see, in the name of the war on terror, this is one of the worst episodes of our nation in terms of our protection of civil and human rights. We are going around the world, still kidnapping people, still sending them off where it's likely they'll be tortured, or using unmanned drones to kill not only the targets, but the innocent bystanders that are there. But, we didn't have to wait for President Obama to see his disregard for the rule of law. He promised this nation, and this was before he won the Democratic nomination for presidency, he promised us that he would join a filibuster against a bill that would provide retroactive immunity for telecommunication companies that colluded with the Bush administration in its felonious warrantless wiretapping program. And by the way, there were telecom companies that did not cooperate. Qwest was one of them. They said, no, it's illegal. We're not going to do that. There were telecommunication companies that did cooperate. It was completely illegal. They spent $12 million on lobbyists over the course of 3 months, and Congress saluted, again, the corrupting influence of money, and they granted, by legislation, retroactive immunity for criminal acts. And President Obama, then a senator, before he got the nomination, said he would join a filibuster in opposition to that bill. And then after he won the nomination, he not only did not join a filibuster, he voted for that legislation. So here we see Congress, with Barack Obama as a senator, setting aside a certain special class of the wealthy and the powerful, saying, oh, you're not going to be held according to law. You don't need to worry about it. You know, we're sending people to federal penitentiaries for decades for selling marijuana or possession of marijuana. I've been dealing with a young man, Weldon Angeles, 3 cells of marijuana, and under minimum mandatory sentencing, because the informant after the fact said, oh yeah, he had a gun with him at the time, he's serving 55 years under minimum mandatory sentencing. So the law, while it's being applied with a vengeance against the rest of us in this country, all 3 branches of government are saying, no, well, for a certain category of people identified by the executive branch, we're going to waive the law as it applies to them. And when I say 3 branches, the courts are included in that, because they've developed this very perverse, truly subversive doctrine, the state secrets doctrine, where the executive branch can make its own determination. When the executive branch violates the law, that very branch can go into the courts and say, oh, by the way, you can't determine these cases on their merits, because to do so would mean the disclosure of important state secrets inimical to the national security. And the courts throw the cases out. So what have we seen during
I think we lost Rocky, but I'll continue until we get him back on the line. Again, our guest is Rocky Anderson, and if you're like me and you're listening to this conversation, your head is spinning and you're saying, wait a minute, this is a candidate for president who's actually talking about what really happened to the United States of America in terms of the rule of law, is really talking about the state secrets doctrine. These are issues. The telecom immunity, the fact that President Obama said that he was going to filibuster this telecom immunity bill, and he did not do it. This is a huge issue, and yet most people listening right now say, oh, wow, I remember something about that. But I forgot, because it's not kept alive in the news, because the mainstream media passes by these outrages that occur in our government, and the American people tend to forget. If it's not on the mainstream media, if not on the Today Show, if it's not on MSNBC, if it's not on CNN, if it's not currently in the ether of our mainstream media outlets, people believe these stories either never happened, forget that they happened, or that they were unimportant. And what happened in this previous administration was so vitally important in terms of rolling back our rights as citizens, in terms of putting us in the position that we are now, of accepting illegality from our public officials because we know that they have influence. One of the most important changes that the Bush administration ushered in was the change that outrageous incidents can occur and no accountability will be brought forward against people who are wealthy and who have influence. That is what occurred. Now, as the 2012 elections near, as we get closer and we're looking at a candidate like Rocky Anderson from the Justice Party, many people will start to ask that question, what about a third-party candidate? Going back to the year 2000, many might agree, many may remember very clearly the Bill Maher program. If you watch Bill Maher, where actually Bill Maher and Michael Moore got down on their knees and begged Ralph Nader not to run for president, begged him not to run as a third-party candidate, because at that time there was the theory that they would take votes away from either the Democratic candidate or the Republican candidate. What's happening now? And hopefully what's happening with you, but what is happening with many Americans, specifically those who are raising their voices in the Occupy movement, is this sort of knowledge coming to bear that there's not really much difference between the Democratic and the Republican Party, that there's not much difference between the candidates of either party. And so, yes, if you don't vote for Obama, maybe someone like Newt Gingrich could win the presidency, which would seem outrageous. But at that point, you have to ask yourself whether constantly holding your nose and voting for a candidate who will barely pass minimal parts of bills that really won't change the overall system but will sound good in name only, a good example being our current health care bill. If you look at a situation like that, then you have to ask yourself, isn't it worth a try? Isn't it worth a try through the new social media that we've seen do incredible things in many, many different areas? We've seen them do incredible things overseas. We've seen them do incredible things in different countries. Whether or not this new social media could indeed be the impetus to move a candidate above and beyond where they traditionally were as a third party when it was just Democrat, Republican, and possibly Green Party. And I have Rocky back on the line right now. Rocky, I don't know if you heard what I was last talking about, but there is that question, of course, that you get when any third party candidate attempts to run. Maybe you're just a spoiler. We go back to, the year 2000 before we came to the realization that elections can be stolen, and before we came to the realization that elections can be bought, that might have been the case. Talk about why you don't think that spoiler rule applies to you.
Well, that is a great question, and actually it deterred me for a while from even getting involved in all of this. But I got to the point, and I think the American people are at this point, where the fear of being a spoiler for the lesser of two evils, and it's not clear that there is necessarily a lesser of two evils right now, but we can't allow that fear of being a spoiler to stop us from changing a system that so badly needs changing. We need to get the corrupting influence of money out of our system of government, out of our electoral system, and it's never going to happen if we simply accept the status quo and say, oh, let's go ahead and vote for the Democrat because it's better than the Republican, or vice versa. They've both been in collusion and bringing us to this devastating point in our nation's history, both in terms of the imperial presidency. They just keep ratcheting up the imperial aspects of the presidency in this country.
Let's talk about that. I don't mean to jump in, but the imperial presidency is very important, and I don't know how many people really understand what you're talking about when you discuss that and what it has become.
Well, it's the president taking on powers that are supposed to belong to other branches of government, where the president can violate the law in such egregious ways and not be held accountable. I mean, we know that the prior president and those in his administration committed war crimes. This is not hyperbole. We're not exaggerating by using that term. We know that to have authorized the kind of treatment that was authorized was in clear violation of the Geneva Convention, the Convention Against Torture, customary international law, but it was also in violation of our own domestic law, the War Crimes Act of 1996. The federal torture statute. These aren't just technical violations of the law. They're blatant violations of important laws that were passed by Congress to prevent the very kinds of things that went on. Same with the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act. After the Church Committee hearings and the disclosure of major abuses by our intelligence community, when they were listening in on conversations, opening people's mail, hiring the mafia to kill Castro, doing the kinds of the infiltration of groups that were acting lawfully to spy on them, to chill the exercise of people's First Amendment rights. after that was all disclosed, which was a great thing for our democracy, it's a kind of investigation and disclosure that President Obama has fought every inch of the way against, as has our cowardly Congress. These are Democrats and Republicans. If we had that kind of investigation, perhaps we'd get some laws in place that would prevent and deter that kind of conduct in the future. But after the Church Committee, they passed the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act, clearly making it a felony.
Let's talk about the fact that it was already a felony when they passed the law making it a felony, which is one of the most bizarre things.
Well, they made it abundantly clear, though, that without a warrant, it was a felony, and it applied to the executive branch. George Bush said, I don't care about those laws. He lied to the country about getting a warrant in every instance. We have that on videotape. And 2 years after or before he'd made that statement, he had already ordered the NSA, who may have cut off our conversation earlier, I don't know what happened there, but he ordered the NSA to engage in illegal surveillance of Americans' communications. And it wasn't just phone conversations, it was email communications, finding out what people were accessing on their website. And no, there hasn't been one prosecution for that. And that's the kind of conduct that, with the collusion of the telecom companies, President Obama, when he was a senator, and the majority of Congress said, let's just forget it. So you raised earlier President Obama coming into power and saying, let's just look forward and not look backward when it comes to war crimes. Can you imagine saying that at Nuremberg? The chief prosecutor there, Justice Robert Jackson, said these prosecutions, international law, and he was talking specifically then about wars of aggression, which also obviously the invasion and occupation of Iraq was a war of aggression. He said these international prohibitions, although being applied against aggressor Germany today, must, if they're to have any meaning, be applied to every single nation on earth, including those sitting in judgment here at Nuremberg, which of course meant that the United States was included. And yet we give such short shrift to those high ideals of the equal application of the laws, both international law and our own domestic law. So the imperial presidency, the president can order the assassination of U.S. citizens and not be held accountable. The president can allow illegal surveillance and not be held accountable, and then the next president comes in and says, about those war crimes, let's just look forward, not backward. Go steal a loaf of bread and try using that defense with the judge and jury as an ordinary citizen. And then the financial crimes. I mean, it just goes on and on. The financial crimes committed by these folks on Wall Street, we know what they did. I mean, we may just know the beginning of what they did because there hasn't been a thorough investigation. There haven't been trials, but we know that they were selling these toxic mortgages and these packages that they were selling as almost no-risk investments, knowing that wasn't the case. And yet there hasn't been one prosecution, not one criminal prosecution of any of those people. And yet they brought this country to its economic knees, had an enormous impact worldwide. What's to deter them next time? There's still apparently banks that are too large to fail. They can make these ridiculous investments, put the entire world economy at risk, and then get away with it, and know they can get away with it because they've invested so much money in electing people. President Obama was the largest recipient of Wall Street money in the history of this country. Then he surrounds himself with all these people from Goldman Sachs, and then there are no prosecutions. I would say they got a really good return on their investment. So getting back to your question about being a spoiler, No, we have got to, as an American people, draw the line and say we're not going to put up with it anymore. We're voting for a different system. We're voting for people who, if it takes a constitutional amendment to get around the Citizens United case and get the corrupting influence of money out of our system, then we're going to do it. And that corrupting influence of money, think about it. Our military contractors, that's why the military-industrial complex still has a stranglehold on our government. It's why we're wasting billions and billions of dollars every year on unnecessary military projects. It's because these folks, Democrats and Republicans, want to take the bacon home to their districts or states. We see Dianne Feinstein do it. We see Utah's Congressman Rob Bishop do it because they have contractors in their districts or in their states. And I pick on them just as examples. It's rampant throughout Congress. The F-22 program, completely outmoded program.
Right.
They got contractors or subcontractors in 42 states so that they get that kind of support in Congress. So these people, while the Department of Defense is saying the F-22 is completely useless to us, these folks are still fighting for funding. Well, they still
they try to use. Sorry to jump in. They try to use the argument that this is making this obsolete aircraft for billions of dollars somehow gives jobs to the American people in their particular cities, which is why they lobby for it and then come home. But it has been proven that there are so many more jobs that could be obtained in those same cities if we were to move forward with green technologies and teaching jobs, all kinds of different jobs. Talk a little bit about that.
Well, we need to be investing in the future of this nation. Building obsolete weapons programs and wasting all this taxpayers' money is so detrimental to the long-term interests of the people of this country. We ought to be providing jobs for people by building our nation's infrastructure. Our infrastructure in this country is in catastrophic condition. It's deteriorated to such an extent that it would take generations, even if we were making the appropriate investments, to catch up to where we ought to be. We ought to be refurbishing every federal building in this country that's over 20 or 30 years old, bringing them up to LEED certified energy efficiency standards. It would create hundreds of thousands of jobs. We ought to be investing in job training. We ought to have the equivalent of the CCC and the WPA, putting people back to work. And we need to be providing much, much better education for our young people. Why does Singapore, why are their test scores so much higher than American students' test scores? It's because of our lack of investment, our commitment to education in this country. Those are the kinds of investments that make sense, not in outmoded military programs just so that these folks can get reelected because they're bringing money back to their states or their districts. I think it borders on treason. It's a sort of bribery. The fact that these people are acting so detrimentally in terms of the public interest and voting for these kinds of programs when there are so many other needs, and we're ignoring our future. Why are we not, for instance, providing the international leadership on climate change and on obtaining energy independence and investing in these new energy technologies? And why is China just cleaning our clock when it comes to all of this? They're building more than half the world's solar panels, more than half the world's wind turbines. Why is that? It's because of the stranglehold that the coal, oil, and gas industries have on our political system. We all know that's the case. Why are we the only industrialized country in the world that doesn't provide essential health care for all of our citizens? And why are our costs more than double the average of the rest of the industrialized world? We get mediocre results, medical results, and we're the only country that doesn't provide that universal coverage. Why? Because of the corrupting influence of money from the medical insurance industry.
That's a perfect place to actually, Rocky, jumping in. That's a perfect place. We need to go to a quick break and come back, and we'll pick up with Rocky Anderson again, presidential candidate for the Justice Party, an alternative to the Democratic and Republican Party. Many people are calling him the candidate of the 99%. We'll be back with Rocky Anderson right after this break. You're listening to the Progressive Radio Network.
We're at a time in our country where we need to define who we are, where we're headed, what we have become. He didn't mention human rights at a time when he has assassination lists for the first time in our nation's history that include U.S. citizens. No due process. We don't just have indefinite detention anymore. We just go out, put their name on a list, and kill them. The invocation of state secrets, it's absolutely obliterated any notion of checks and balances. Our courts have been removed from that equation by and large when it comes to torture, when it comes to warrantless wiretapping by our government. No discussion about that, of course. And we're seeing really an institutionalization by this president of some of the worst abuses and what a lot of us thought were just aberrations during the Bush years. But also the disconnect between saying that we're at a Sputnik moment, we're going to make all these great investments and build our economy, and then what's he building the economy on? He says it's based on tax cuts. He sounded like Ronald Reagan. It sounded like trickle-down economics. And how do you freeze domestic annual spending and at the same time make these tremendous investments that are needed in our infrastructure and doing what's required to get people back to work? He didn't mention the middle class, the huge disparity between the very wealthy. There hasn't been a greater disparity in this country in wealth and income since the 1920s. The top 1% have more net wealth than the bottom 90% in this country. These are the basics. These are the fundamentals. And it was all ignored. And it really seems that these two parties, bought and paid for by the same interests, by and large, are not providing the kinds of solutions or addressing the fundamentals that the American people are most interested in, that impact the American people the most.
And that is Rocky Anderson speaking right after last year's State of the Union, that clip courtesy of Democracy Now!, in response to President Obama's speech. And Rocky, I have a caller on the line. At the very end of that, you were talking about the fact that the choice between Democrats and Republicans really is, in a sense, no choice at all. And I've got Dave on from Reno to talk about that. Welcome to the Solution Zone, Dave. Thanks for calling in.
Hi, thanks, Rocky. You know, a lot of what you're saying makes incredible sense. But what I'm confused about is how, let's say you're elected, how do you deal with that kind of machine that there is in Washington when there are so many interests that would work against logic, that would work against, this is why it is the way it is right now, because nothing can really get done, even if there is a good idea, because there's so much political posturing, there's so much, everybody in Congress has to worry about they're not really worried as much about their constituents as they are about the people that are giving them money. So until that changes, where is the hope? Because if I could vote for you, I'd vote for you right now. If you could be into office, but I'm just wondering how, doesn't the whole system have to change?
Please stay on just a minute. I'd love to have this discussion. We can't be resigned to this status quo. This system is diseased. It's corrupt. And the way to overcome it is the American people. Look at all the successful movements in this country for positive social progress. The anti-slavery movement, the women's suffrage movement, the civil rights movement, the labor movement, they all started with the grassroots. Ordinary people who felt passionately, who were tenacious, who wouldn't let up. And they overcame the corrupting influence of money. I mean, there was plenty of it against the labor movement, We know that. And it's because people organized and wouldn't let up. Like Joe Hill said just before he was executed in Salt Lake City, great labor organizer, he said, don't mourn, organize. And that's exactly what we can do. We've seen people come together, they put their lives on the line. And through social networking, we were talking earlier about how are we going to do this? We're going to do it through grassroots organizing, through social media, the democratization of communications now that have helped bring about major changes, revolutions in nations that were governed by dictators. We can do that in this country. But we can't be resigned to saying, well, geez, that's the way it is, and there's all this money back there. Use the money against them. Make it like a keto. Use that against them to show how it is that the money's flowing in and how these people are voting. They have prostituted themselves, Democrats and Republicans alike. They've absolutely prostituted themselves, and we hear the same thing from them. Well, that's just the way it is back here. That's the game that we're playing. Those are the rules that we play by. And I've got to say, these aren't necessarily bad people. They're cowardly. They're not fighting to change the system. There are a handful of them, certainly, and there are some real heroes along the way. But they're very few and far between. Both of these parties have helped build this perverse, corrupt system, not fighting for reform. Rather, they're playing into it. They're not only sustaining the system, but they're sustained by it. And we've got to break that cycle. It's hurting our country so badly, and it's hurting the rest of the world. We know, for instance, neither of these parties are ever going to show the kind of leadership we need on climate change, and it's the most important issue in terms of long-term. It's going to be shorter-term, catastrophic consequences around the world. And our leaders are acting like it's not even happening. I mean, President Obama, last time he ran, talked about, oh, yeah, we've got to provide this leadership. He's done nothing about it. In fact, he's caved to the polluting industries. Really, did he wake up one day and say, hey, I think it would be great for the public interest to veto the EPA in further restricting ozone emissions? No, he did that because of the corrupting influence of money from the polluting industries. So, I'm sorry, I can't remember your name when you came on, but don't you agree that if we can just get over this resignation and acceptance of the status quo, and all of us together say, man, if the Egyptians could get out in Tahrir Square and use their social media and put their lives on the line to change their government, we can do it too.
Dave?
I never thought until I saw the Occupy Wall Street, until I saw that movement, I did not realize people were actually awake out there and that we're having a problem because we've had so many years of people just being too busy and not really, and just letting it just keep going, and it gets worse and it gets worse, and it's like the host said a little while ago, is that the attention span of the American people is really small, and it's only what they're force fed by major media outlets that really sinks in, and if they watch the Today Show and they think, oh, there's really no problem, there is no problem, and they're so distracted by celebrity and things that really do not matter that you have a culture where it's accepted. And it for me, it's amazing because I remember Watergate. I'm old enough to remember Watergate, and I think, wow, I felt growing up that there was justice, that there was, you just can't do something like that. And after the Bush administration, after 8 years of the Bush administration, I just thought, wow. And then even with Obama not doing what he should have done with war crimes, you think there is no accountability. There is no accountability, and that's the biggest problem that we have. But I agree with everything you're saying. I think it's fantastic, and I think you're right. I just hope that it won't take a depression for everybody to wake up.
Well, Gore, you're absolutely right about the memory in this country. Gore Vidal called it the United States of amnesia, and the advantage we have now in terms of working toward change is people don't have to look back. They just have to look at their situation right now. People who have saved all their lives, they have their 401k plans or their pensions, they've been decimated by this economic disaster that was brought to us by the Republicans and the Democrats that we sent back to Congress and we placed in the White House to protect our interests, and they completely abandoned us because of the corrupting influence of money from Wall Street. And now no one, as I said earlier, is being held criminally accountable. And there was gross criminality that brought us to this point, and the American people know it. And we're still suffering from it. And the only way to change this is to pursue a very, very different path, and that's the path of the Justice Party. Let's build this movement. Let's get everybody committed. Don't let fear. There's been so much fear driving such bad public policy in this country. Don't let fear that the lesser of two evils might not get elected because we're going to choose a different path.
Great answer. Dave, thanks for your call. I appreciate it.
Thank you, Dave.
Thank you.
Great to have you on. And 888-874-4888 is the number to call the Progressive Radio Network. We are also podcasting on iTunes, and you can go to the website PRN, progressiveradionetwork.org and tweet us. You can tweet us as well at PRN_radio and PRN.FM. So a couple different ways to respond. Rocky, great answer there. And I think that has been the problem with a lot of people. They want to do the right thing, and they've been sitting around waiting for somebody, and you and I were talking before the show about this final realization that people seem to be coming to as we look across the country and see the Occupy movements. In that clip that I played as we came back from the break, that was a year ago that you, Rocky, were talking about the disparity between the rich and the poor. You referred to it as the 90%, but you were talking about this. I've been talking about this for years. What does it feel like, and maybe this is what gave you hope to run, to suddenly see this conversation cropping up everywhere? Everybody now knows about the 99%.
You know, I sounded like David when we used to have these demonstrations in Salt Lake City, of all places. Thousands of people would come out every time President Bush came to town. And by the end, I said, you know, we've got to stop pointing our finger at them, at Rumsfeld and Bush and Cheney. We need to start pointing the fingers at ourselves. Why aren't we out doing everything we can to change this? I said, we ought to be in the streets every day. We ought to be shutting cities down. We ought to be going on general strikes. And, I mean, not only the human rights abuses, but what was happening to our economy, what was being done in the name of our country, where we used to be so proud to distinguish ourselves from those nations that were engaging in these massive human rights abuses. And I'd mentioned, as David did, it seemed that sports, entertainment, the addiction to celebrity, television, all this mindless so-called entertainment was the new opiate of the masses, that everybody was just being sent off to sleep, anesthetized in effect. Well, our country was transforming in front of our very eyes. And now what do we see? The Occupy movement. And it's not just the occupiers, these amazingly courageous people that are out there day after day after day because they know that what's going on in our country is so wrong and it needs to be changed. There needs to be radical change in our economy and our governance. But it's not just them, it's the hundreds of thousands and millions of people in this country that are with them, that are supporting them, and are saying, yeah. And these are Republicans, Democrats, Libertarians, Greens, Independents. Across the board, people are saying they're absolutely right. We have been had here. And there are very few people who are benefiting a lot from it. I mean, we can't ever have a system in the future, and we will with the Democrats and Republicans, but we need to demand as a people in this country, there should never be a bank that is too large to fail, a bank that can engage in these unbelievably risky transactions so they can bring in all the returns and stuff their pockets with their multi-million-dollar bonuses. Or if the investments go bad, then the American taxpayers end up bailing them out, and they still get their multi-million-dollar bonuses. That has got to come to an end. And when the prior caller talked about history, let's look back at Franklin Roosevelt. Let's look back at Teddy Roosevelt. They talked, they didn't just talk about busting the trusts. They did it. FDR, think of the opposition he had when he proposed a Social Security program. Boy, talk about accusations of he's a socialist, a communist. How can you pass this redistribute wealth the way that he's talking about? And now, for decades it's worked. We've provided this great safety net for the most vulnerable in our society. And now we have a president and a majority of Democrats in Congress that are ready to give up on a lot of that. They've put it out on the table. It's basically a fait accompli now that they're willing to get, some revenues from the very wealthiest, which should never have been given up in the first place. And by the way, we wouldn't have seen those Bush tax cuts without some Democrats voting for it, just like we wouldn't have seen this disastrous war of aggression against Iraq without the Democrats giving President Bush a blank check.
Or the deregulation of Wall Street without the ending of Glass-Steagall, which was President Clinton's watch.
Absolutely, and these outrageous trade agreements, the so-called free trade agreements that didn't provide any protections for workers, didn't provide any of the environmental protections. It was so predictable. Everybody called it. It's going to be disastrous for working men and women in this country to sign off on those trade agreements. So this isn't a Republican or Democratic problem. It is a Republican and Democratic problem that with either one of them in power, we're going to see a continuation of these fundamental problems. We need a new way. The Justice Party is providing a means, and we're not the final answer by any means. There ought to be a number of parties that are working this kind of thing out, but we need to get behind the Justice Party. We need to field good candidates that will say at the local, the state, the federal level that they're in agreement with our basic platform, and we need this revolution in American politics where our government, once again, is representing the public interest rather than the narrow, special, corporate, and other concentrated wealth interests.
Let's tell listeners where to go. First of all, voterocky.org they can go to get all of the news on your campaign. With the Justice Party, they can just Google Justice Party, but what would you direct them to in terms of going to that website? Is it justiceparty.org?
No, it's Justice Party USA. Because Justice Party, somebody already, I understand it was somebody in the Tea Party already grabbed that name. So it's justicepartyusa.org. And let me say this, I'm limiting contributions to my campaign to $100 per person, not taking any corporate money. We're allowing everybody to come to this campaign on an equal basis.
I want to reiterate, not taking any corporate money. Not taking any corporate money. That is huge.
Well, and so is only taking $100 because
right.
It makes it more difficult for us, but it shows the commitment in terms of principle that we're going to keep the corrupting money of influence out of this, and we're going to find ways to appeal to the people so that we're building a grassroots movement, a truly grassroots movement. I mean, President Obama brags, his folks are bragging about raising over $1 billion for his campaign. That in and of itself, that's an obscenity. It's so anti-democratic. And we know what that money buys. It buys President Obama vetoing the EPA in further restricting the emission of ozone. And I can tell you, when he put off the decision on the Keystone Pipeline, that's all he was doing was postponing it until after the election. I know a lot of people were really happy about that. They thought it was a good sign. No, he's going to approve that pipeline. We know he is because he's backed out of every promise that he's made in the past, and he hasn't made any promises about this other than he's putting it off, and Hillary Clinton's State Department has already signified approval for that pipeline. Now they're supposed to take into account things like climate change. Well, do you think that ought to have been taken into account in the beginning?
Let's talk about how you can do these things, because besides having good ideas, I want our listeners to know, again, we're with Rocky Anderson, who is running for president with the Justice Party, if you've just tuned in. I want to talk about what you did in Salt Lake City, what you were able to do with regard to climate change. For instance, you yourself, as a mayor of that city, went ahead and implemented the Kyoto Protocols and exceeded them by 48%. You were able to do
right.
that. So you're a doer.
Amazing. Yep. You set these goals. It's amazing when you keep your eye on your objectives, what you can accomplish. In 3 years, we reduced greenhouse gas emissions in city operations by 31%. And we put in place some really amazing practices. And then we didn't just leave it there. We wanted to share that with others because we knew that whatever we did wasn't going to make the difference. But if we shared it with mayors around the country and around the world, we could magnify those results in ways that really would matter. And Robert Redford and I got together along with an organization called ICLE, International Council for Local Environmental Initiatives, and we brought in over the course of 3 years to Sundance dozens of mayors who, some of them were pretty agnostic about climate change when they got there. But they all went back to their communities. They did amazing things. Mark Begich, who was then mayor of Anchorage, came in. He didn't know anything about climate change. He admitted it, didn't really have a view on it. He left the Sundance Summit, went back. He incorporated all these great practices, methane recovery at his landfill, green building standards for all government buildings, and now he's a United States Senator doing great work on climate change. He knows how important that is, not only to humankind around the world, but to our national security. So we can get these things done, but we need people that have got the heart for it, people who at their core believe in the importance of doing these things rather than just playing politics with them and then selling off to the highest bidder. And that's
Let's talk about really quick.
Right?
Don't mean to jump in, but I wanted to get you weighing in on this quote, end of the Iraq War, which we know President Obama is going to be taking major credit for, as if he went ahead and did this. One of the things I want to point out before I give you a chance to comment is that the reason that we left Iraq, that was already put in place by President Bush. The date for withdrawing from Iraq was actually in place, and it's great that we adhered to it, but the Obama administration disingenuously was actually arguing to remain in Iraq and leave several thousand troops there. And the only reason that they didn't do it is because the Iraqi government would not agree to give U.S. soldiers blanket immunity for grave abuses like killing civilians. And the United States wanted total immunity from any prosecution of any U.S. troop remaining in Iraq. They said no. And so then we went ahead and withdrew our troops and, quote, ended the war. So this is one of those strange PR spins a lot of people don't understand. You have been about leaving Iraq forever. We're in Afghanistan. Just talk about your position on the war, which is no longer discussed as a political issue, amazingly.
It is amazing, and I think the reason why is because most people don't feel this. We don't have a draft. We're mostly enlisting the poor in this country, and a large part of that is because we don't have other good jobs, and we don't have a good educational system or good jobs training in this country. And so where is it being felt in this nation? I mean, this is happening as if we're not really at war right now. Well, I can tell you we're building up a lot of hatred around the world. Every single day we're seeing as an occupying force in these Muslim countries. And I'm so glad you raised that about Iraq, because for the Obama administration to take credit for pulling out of Iraq is so hypocritical, given the fact that they wanted to stay there, and the only reason they didn't is because the Iraqis finally said that they would not grant immunity for liability to our forces who are there. I mean,
but the contractors are still there. There are thousands and thousands of U.S. contractors there.
That's right. And our government, when contractors, these people with Blackwater, would open fire and kill Iraqi citizens, what did our government do? No accountability. They swooped them up, got them out of the country, and then they fought against their prosecution in our own courts for their criminal misconduct. And the reason that they haven't been pursued is because of a finding by the courts that they were granted immunity by our government officials. It is just unbelievable, the arrogance with which we've dealt with these other nations. I mean, if your child was killed by an unmanned drone making one of these attacks in a Muslim country that we're occupying, wouldn't you consider being a suicide bomber? I'm not saying any of it's right. I'm just saying it's certainly understandable when we go around the world and we do this. Iran right now, I mean, such concern, and there ought to be, about their building up nuclear capability. Talk about the United States of amnesia. People need to realize that the root of all of this was the overthrow of the democratically elected Mossadegh government by the United States. Under President Eisenhower, President Truman said, no way are we going to get involved in that. Britain wanted us to help them out. Truman said, nope, that's not what we do in other nations. President Eisenhower came in, with the Dulles brothers as Secretary of State and Secretary of Defense, and they were happy to go in and help overthrow this democratically elected government. And then the next year, they did the same thing in Guatemala. Is it any wonder that we're so hated around the world when we conduct ourselves so arrogantly, so viciously, without any regard for the cruelty of our actions?
It's for profit. The regard is for profit. I don't mean to jump in, Rocky, but we only have about 2 minutes left, and I wanted to give you a chance again to direct people to your website, voterocky.org, and also to go to the Justice Party. It's the Justice Party USA.org to find out more about the issues, where you stand on climate change, where you stand on the economy, where you stand on all of these issues. And I want to give you a chance for some final thoughts about people, what we can do to change our country, and how you're part of that.
Well, thank you so much. If we're going to take the power away from the very wealthy, the corporations and other folks with concentrated wealth who have been controlling our government at odds with the public interest, we all need to take a stand. We can't sit back as bystanders anymore. We all need to stand up, be upstanders, take a part in this, contribute, provide your help in terms of your time. We need state-by-state organizing to get ballot access. Help us out in any way you can. Get on our website. Send us a note. Let us know how you can help. Send in contributions. Do everything you can, because we're all in this together, and we're all doing it for the right reasons. And this is not only about our interests, it's for the future. Let's be good stewards in our nation and turn things around.
Wonderful to have you on the program. VoteRocky.org. Go there and take a look at his site. And Rocky, all hope towards you, all best wishes, and keep fighting the good fight. There's a lot of people out there who want to go along with you.
Thank you so much for helping us get out the word. Take care.
Great to have you on the program.
Thank you.
And that's it for the Solution Zone. I'm Christiane Brown. We will be with you next week on the Progressive Radio Network.
And whatever comes our way.